I thought I was selling my soul for a corner office and a seven-figure salary, but I quickly realized I wasn't a partner in the firm. I was the experiment. When the truth about my mother's kindness came to light, I discovered my entire life was a lie, designed to see exactly how much it would take to break me. I used to believe that integrity was a currency. I thought that if I worked harder than everyone else, if I kept my hands clean and my promises ironclad, the world would eventually reward me with the life I deserved. My father was a high school teacher who died with nothing but a garage full of old books and a reputation for being the fairest man in town. I watched my mother struggle to pay for his funeral, and that was the day the first crack appeared in my moral foundation. Integrity didn't pay for headstones. Integrity didn't keep the lights on. By the time I reached my 30s, I was a mid-level analyst at Sterling and Cross, a private equity firm that moved money like water. I was the guy everyone trusted. I was the guy who stayed until midnight, checking the ethics of our offshore accounts, while my colleagues were out at high-end galas, rubbing elbows with the elite. I was Reliable Elias. It was a title that felt more like a cage every passing year. I was 34, living in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaky faucet, watching men half as talented but twice as ruthless climb the corporate ladder in bespoke suits that cost more than my car. The turning point came on a Tuesday. It's funny how the biggest mistakes of your life usually start on a mundane Tuesday. I was summoned to the 40th floor, the glass heavens, to meet with Marcus Vane. Vane was the CEO, a man who didn't just walk into a room, he possessed it. He was the personification of everything I told myself I despised, arrogant, obscenely wealthy, and whispered to be involved in the kind of market manipulation that ruined lives. When I entered his office, he didn't look up from his monitor. He let me stand there for exactly 3 minutes. I know because I counted every tick of the vintage grandfather clock against the wall. Finally, he leaned back, his eyes sharp and predatory. He told me he'd been watching my work. He praised my attention to detail and my unwavering commitment to the rules. Then he leaned forward and dropped a thick blue folder on the desk. Inside was the proposed acquisition of a massive renewable energy company. It looked perfect on the surface, but a quick glance at the internal audits showed a discrepancy, a black hole of debt hidden behind a shell company. If I signed off on the audit as the lead compliance officer, the merger would go through, Vane would pocket a 9-figure bonus, and the public shareholders would be left holding the bag when the company inevitably collapsed in 3 years. Vane didn't dress it up in corporate jargon. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Elias, you can stay in your little cubicle, being the most honest man in a room full of thieves, or you can take the shortcut. Sign this. And by Monday, you're the senior vice president of global strategy. You get the corner office, the 7-figure salary, and the keys to a life you've only watched through a window. I don't need a saint. I need a partner." The old Elias should have walked out. He should have reported Vane to the SEC. But the new Elias, the one who was tired of being the runner-up in the race of life, reached for the pen. I told myself it was just once. I told myself I could use that power to do good later. I signed the documents, the ink feeling like a brand on my soul. The transformation was immediate. Within 48 hours, my life shifted into a different dimension. I moved into a penthouse that overlooked the city skyline. I traded my beat-up sedan for a charcoal gray Italian sports car that roared like a caged animal. People who had ignored me for years suddenly laughed at all my jokes. I felt a surge of adrenaline I'd never known. Power, I realized, was a much better drug than virtue. For 6 months, I lived the dream. I was Vane's right-hand man. I helped him navigate the gray areas of international law, silencing my conscience with vintage scotch and expensive watches. I felt untouchable. I had abandoned my principles, and in return, the world had finally bowed to me. I thought I had won. I thought I had outsmarted destiny. But then, the letters started arriving. At first, I thought it was just a prank. a plain white envelope left on my desk containing nothing but a photocopy of my signature on that original fraudulent audit. No note, no ransom demand, just the evidence. I burned it in my fireplace, my hands trembling slightly, telling myself it was just a disgruntled employee. I had security. I had lawyers. I was safe. A week later, a second envelope appeared. This one wasn't at the office. It was sitting on my kitchen island inside my locked, high-security penthouse. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tore it open. Inside was a photograph. It wasn't a photo of the documents this time. It was a photo of me, taken from a distance, standing at my father's grave 3 years ago. On the back, written in elegant, terrifyingly familiar handwriting, were 4 words: "The debt is due." I checked my security cameras, but the footage for the last hour was a loop of an empty hallway. My pulse was a deafening drum in my ears. I realized then that I wasn't being blackmailed for money. Someone was playing a game with me, someone who knew exactly how I had sold my soul and was now coming to collect. I spent the next 3 days in a state of high-functioning paranoia. Every shadow was a threat. Every phone call made me jump. Vane noticed my distraction. He pulled me aside and told me to get my act together, reminding me that if I fell, I'd be falling alone. I realized then that my partner was just as much a predator to me as he was to everyone else. Friday night, I decided to disappear for a few days to clear my head. I packed a bag and headed to the basement garage of my building. The air was cool and smelled of exhaust and expensive concrete. I walked toward my car, the chirping of my key fob echoing in the silence. As I reached for the door handle, I noticed something tucked under the windshield wiper. Another envelope. This one was red. I reached for it, my breath hitching, but before I could touch it, the lights in the garage flickered and died. I was plunged into total darkness. My heart stopped for a beat, then surged into a frantic rhythm. I fumbled for my phone, the flashlight beam cutting through the gloom like a desperate blade. I scanned the pillars, the rows of luxury cars, the exits. Nothing. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic clicking sound. Tap, tap, tap. Like a cane hitting the pavement. It was coming from the shadows directly behind my car. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The clicking stopped. A voice, low and distorted as if through a modulator, echoed through the concrete cavern. "You thought the price was just your principles, Elias," the voice whispered, seemingly from everywhere and nowhere at once. "But you didn't read the fine print. You didn't just sell your soul to Marcus Vane. You sold it to us." Suddenly, the headlights of my own car roared to life, blinding me. I shielded my eyes, stumbling back. Through the glare, I saw a figure standing by the driver's side door. They weren't holding a gun or a knife. They were holding a tablet. On the screen, a live feed began to play. It was a video of my mother's house. I watched in horror as a man in a dark suit walked up to her front door and rang the bell. My mother opened the door, smiling, welcoming him in. The figure in the garage stepped closer, the light from the tablet illuminating a mask that chilled me to the bone. It was a ceramic replica of my own father's face. "Now," the voice said, "let's talk about what you're going to do to keep her alive." I stood paralyzed in the frigid air of the parking garage, the ceramic eyes of my father's likeness staring back at me. It was a grotesque mockery of the man who had taught me to value the truth above all else. The figure wearing the mask didn't move. They didn't have to. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that I felt the physical weight of it pressing against my chest, making every breath a chore. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. My voice sounded small, stripped of the corporate bravado I had spent the last 6 months cultivating. "Balance," the voice replied, distorted and mechanical. The figure held the tablet higher. On the screen, the man in the dark suit was now sitting at my mother's kitchen table. She was pouring him a cup of tea, her face radiating the gentle kindness that had always been her greatest vulnerability. She had no idea she was hosting a wolf. "You think you're a player in a grand game, Elias," the voice continued, but you're just a line of code in a much larger algorithm. Marcus Vane didn't choose you for your talent. He chose you because you were the easiest to break. And now, you're going to help us break him." The demand was simple and devastating. On Thursday, Sterling and Cross was set to finalize the Aegis project, the very merger I had falsified the audits for. It was a deal worth billions, a consolidation of energy assets that would effectively grant Vane a monopoly over the state's power grid. The masked figure wanted me to upload a logic bomb into the firm's internal server during the final signing ceremony. It wouldn't just stop the merger, it would trigger a recursive loop that would dump every shred of Vane's illegal correspondence, every hidden offshore account, and every bribed politician's name directly onto the front page of every major news outlet in the world. "If you do this," the voice whispered, "Vane goes to prison for the rest of his life. The firm collapses. The new Elias dies, but your mother stays alive. She gets to keep her son even if he's a pauper again." "And if I don't?" The figure didn't answer. They simply tapped the tablet screen. The man in my mother's kitchen reached into his jacket and subtly revealed the grip of a suppressed pistol. My mother, oblivious, pushed a plate of cookies toward him. "You have 48 hours, the figure said. The lights in the garage hummed back to life with a violent flicker. By the time my eyes adjusted, the figure was gone. Only the red envelope remained, resting on my windshield like a bloodstain. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my multi-million-dollar living room, staring at the city lights, feeling like a man on death row watching his last sunset. I was trapped between two monsters. If I helped the masked figure, this ledger group, Vane would realize I was the leak. He wasn't the kind of man to wait for a trial. He would have me erased before the first news cycle ended. But if I told Vane, the ledger would kill my mother. The next morning, the office felt like a mausoleum. Every smile from a colleague felt like a bared tooth. I walked into the glass heavens with the logic bomb contained on a drive no larger than a thumbprint, hidden inside the lining of my $5,000 Blazer. Vane was in high spirits. He was pacing his office, barking orders into a speakerphone. When he saw me, he gestured for me to sit. He looked energized, almost manic. 24 hours, Elias, he said, slamming his hand onto the mahogany desk. Tomorrow we own the Lightning. You've done well. I've already authorized a $5 million discretionary bonus for you. It'll hit your account the second the ink is dry. Thank you, Marcus, I said, my throat feeling like it was filled with glass. He stopped pacing and looked at me. Really looked at me. His eyes narrowed, the predator within sensing a change in the wind. You look pale. Are you getting cold feet? Tell me you're not turning back into that pathetic little analyst who cared about the rules. Just a lack of sleep, I lied, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The scale of it is just hitting me. Vane walked around the desk and leaned in close, his shadow engulfing me. Remember what we talked about, Elias. People like us, we don't have the luxury of fear. We moved past that the moment we decided to win. Don't disappoint me. I've invested too much in your soul to have it start acting up now. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hypervigilance. I had to get to the main server room, but Vane's security was tighter than a drum. I was watched. Every move I made was tracked by the high-definition cameras that lined the halls. As the sun began to set, I received a text from an unknown number. No text, just a video file. I opened it with trembling fingers. It was a video of me taken 10 minutes ago, sitting at my desk. The camera was hidden inside my own office's smoke detector. They are watching you from the inside, too, I realized. The ledger wasn't just some external threat. They were already part of the architecture of my life. Desperate, I decided I needed leverage. If I was going to survive this, I needed something on Vane that was bigger than the merger. I knew he kept a private safe in a hidden compartment behind the floor-to-ceiling wine rack in his office. I'd seen him access it once when he thought I was looking at the view. I waited until 9 p.m. The office was mostly empty, save for the night security and the cleaning crews. I used my executive override to enter Vane's suite. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and cold ambition. My hands shook as I manipulated the wine rack, finding the hidden pressure plate. The wall slid back with a soft hiss, revealing a state-of-the-art biometric safe. I had prepared for this. I had lifted Vane's fingerprints from a glass he'd used earlier that day, using a kit I'd bought in a panic-induced haze of research. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble from a man with no cards left to play. The safe clicked. The heavy door swung open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or gold bars. There were only 3 things: a burner phone, a single black ledger, and an old, grainy photograph. I grabbed the photo first. It was my father. He wasn't in a classroom. He was standing in front of the Sterling and Cross building, 30 years younger, looking stern and formidable. He was shaking hands with a man whose face had been aggressively scratched out with a blade. I opened the ledger. It wasn't a record of money. It was a record of names, dates, and accidents. I flipped through the pages, my breath hitching as I saw familiar names of CEOs and politicians who had died under mysterious circumstances over the last 3 decades. Then I reached the final entry. It was dated the week of my father's death. Subject: Thomas Miller. Status: terminated. Method: induced arrhythmia. Reason: non-compliance with the foundation. My father hadn't died of a heart attack. He had been murdered, and he hadn't been a fair high school teacher. He had been something else entirely. Suddenly, the office lights flared to a blinding intensity. "I wondered how long it would take for your bloodline to kick in," a voice boomed. I spun around. Marcus Vane was standing in the doorway, but he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was the man in the dark suit from my mother's house. But the man wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a briefcase, and he bowed slightly to Vane. Vane walked into the room, a cold, triumphant smile on his face. "Did you really think the ledger was a separate entity, Elias? Did you really think there was a good side trying to take me down?" He gestured to the man in the suit. "Meet the ledger, my private enforcement wing. We don't just find people with principles, Elias. We recruit them. We break them. And if they can't be broken, well, you saw what happened to your father." I looked from Vane to the hitman, my world fracturing. The letters, the mask. "It was all you?" "A test," Vane said, stepping closer until his face was inches from mine. "A final exam to see if you had the stomach to betray me to save your pathetic past. And you failed, Elias. You chose to play the hero." He reached out and took the thumb drive from my blazer pocket before I could even react. He held it up, mocking me. "But here's the beauty of it," Vane whispered. "I'm still going to have you upload this, only it's not a logic bomb for me. It's the final piece of the puzzle that frames the SEC's lead investigator for the very fraud I committed. You're going to be my star witness. You're going to tell the world he blackmailed you." He leaned in closer, his voice a lethal hiss. "And if you don't, I won't kill your mother. That's too quick. I'll make sure she watches as I dismantle every single thing she thinks she knows about her honest husband and her successful son. I'll make her wish she died in that kitchen." Vane handed me the drive back. "The meeting starts in 5 minutes. Walk in there, put on your smile, and destroy the last man who tried to help your father." I stood there, the drive heavy in my hand, the ghost of my father screaming in my mind. I turned toward the door, my legs leaden, but as I passed the hitman, he leaned in and whispered something that Vane couldn't hear. "Check the last page of the ledger, Elias, the one you didn't turn to." I froze. As Vane walked ahead, confident in his victory, I stole a glance at the very last page of the black book still in the safe. My heart stopped. The last entry wasn't about me. It was a name I never expected to see, a name that changed everything I thought I knew about my mother. The name etched into the final page of the black ledger didn't just shock me, it felt like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Sarah Miller. Role, architect of ethical resilience. Status, active. Oversight. Subject, 7-4 Nucky. The ink was fresh. My mother's name. My mother, who cried over grocery bills. My mother, who had worn the same winter coat for a decade to ensure I had new school shoes. The subject 742 was me, my entire life. The struggle, the poverty, the integrity my father had supposedly died for. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a curriculum. Moving, isn't it? Vane's voice drifted over my shoulder, oily and satisfied. To realize that you were never a victim of circumstance, Elias. You were a project. Your father was the failure. He developed a conscience he wasn't supposed to have. He started believing the lies he was telling you. But Sarah? Sarah is a professional. I felt a surge of nausea so violent I had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk to stay upright. The hitman in the dark suit, the man who had been in her kitchen, wasn't a threat to her. He was her subordinate. "You're lying," I hissed, though the precision of the ledger and the cold efficiency of everything I'd witnessed told me otherwise. "Check the burner phone, Elias," Vane said, checking his watch. "But do it quickly. We have a world to change." I grabbed the phone from the safe. There was only one contact saved, Mother. I opened the sent messages. There were hundreds of them, dating back years. Subject showing 14% increase in ambition. Phase 2 initiated. Subject has entered Sterling and Cross. Integrity levels holding. Prepare the Vane catalyst. Subject has accepted the bribe. Resilience broken. Proceed to the harvest. Every milestone of my life, my graduation, my first job, the day I moved into the penthouse, had been reported back to this foundation. My mother wasn't a school teacher's widow. She was my handler. "Why?" I whispered, the word feeling like ash in my mouth. "Because power is too important to be left to the lucky," Vane said, his voice hardening. "The foundation doesn't just hire leaders, we grow them. We cultivate them in the soil of adversity, water them with principles, and then we see if they have the strength to prune those principles away when the sun shines. You passed, Elias. You chose power over the ghost of your father's morals. You're ready to join the board." He gestured toward the door. "Now, let's go. Arthur Vance is waiting in the boardroom. He's the SEC's pit bull, and he's been trying to dismantle the foundation since your father passed. You're going to give him the drive. You're going to tell him you're a whistleblower, and when he plugs that drive into his government-encrypted laptop, it will upload a virus that won't just frame him, it will give us a backdoor into the SEC's entire investigative database. We won't just be above the law, Elias. We will be the law." I was led out of the office like a prisoner dressed in a king's robes. The walk to the boardroom felt like a journey to the gallows. The new Elias, the one who wanted the cars and the penthouse, was screaming in terror, realized he had walked into a trap that had been set before he was even born. The boardroom was a temple of glass and steel. At the center of the long table sat Arthur Vance. He was an older man, his face a map of weary determination. He looked like my father would have looked if he'd lived. When I entered, his eyes softened with a look of genuine hope. "Elias," he said, standing up and reaching out a hand, "I can't tell you how long I've waited for this. Your father was my best friend. He died trying to get me the evidence I needed to stop Vane. To see you standing here, ready to finish what he started. It means everything." Vane stood by the door, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying the theater of it. He was watching me murder the legacy of the only man who had ever truly loved me. I looked at the thumb drive in my hand. It was a tiny piece of plastic that held the power to destroy an innocent man and cement a tyranny that had raised me like cattle. "I have the evidence, Arthur," I said, my voice sounding hollow. "I knew you'd come through," Vance said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled a ruggedized government laptop from his briefcase and flipped it open. This is a direct line to the Attorney General's office. Once we upload the files, the tactical teams move in. Vane and his foundation will be finished by midnight. I stepped toward the laptop. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped the drive. I looked back at Vane. He gave me a sharp, imperceptible nod. Behind him, the man in the dark suit tapped his pocket, a reminder of the threat to my mother. But I knew now that it wasn't a threat to her. It was a threat to me. If I didn't do this, she wouldn't be the victim. She would be the executioner. I reached for the USB port. "Stop," a voice in my head screamed. "Think. If my mother was the architect and Vane was the CEO, then this whole framing the SEC plan was just another test. Or was it? If they already had the power, why did they need me to do it? Because the Foundation didn't just want the data. They wanted the blood. They wanted me to be the one to pull the trigger so I could never, ever turn back. They were making me an accomplice in the highest form of treason. Just as the tip of the drive touched the port, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A private call. I pulled it out, ignoring Vane's sudden scowl. I answered it. "Elias," the voice on the other end said. It was my mother. But the warmth was gone. It was a voice of pure, glacial authority. "Don't be a fool like your father. He thought he could find a third way. He thought he could hide you from the truth. He was weak. You are not. You killed him," I whispered into the phone, the boardroom falling into a dead silence. "I corrected a mistake," she replied. "Now plug in the drive, or I will have to admit that this entire 34-year experiment was a waste of my time, and I hate wasting time, Elias." I looked at Arthur Vance, who was staring at me with growing confusion and alarm. "Elias? Is everything okay? Who is that?" I looked at the screen of the laptop. I looked at the drive. I looked at Vane, who was now moving toward me, sensing my hesitation. "Elias, do it now!" Vane barked. I didn't plug it in. Instead, I gripped the drive and smashed it against the edge of the steel table. The plastic shattered and the delicate circuit board snapped in half. Vane stopped in his tracks, his face turning a shade of purple I'd never seen. Arthur Vance jumped back, knocking his chair over. "You pathetic, sniveling," Vane began, but he was interrupted by a sound that came from the ceiling, a sharp metallic clack. The vents in the room hissed, and a pale, odorless mist began to pour into the boardroom. "What is this?" Arthur yelled, clutching his throat. I looked at the phone in my hand. My mother was still on the line. I could hear her sigh, a sound of genuine disappointment. "I told you, Elias," she said. "I hate wasting time. If the subject is compromised, the lab must be sterilized." Vane's eyes went wide. He lunged for the door, but it had already been electronically sealed. He pounded on the glass, screaming for the man in the dark suit, but the hitman was gone. The glass heavens had become a gas chamber. As I felt my own lungs begin to burn, my mother's voice whispered one last thing through the phone. "Check your other pocket, Elias, the one I sewed into your blazer when you were 10. I always knew you'd be your father's son in the end." My vision began to blur as I slumped to the floor next to a gasping Arthur Vance. With the last of my strength, I reached into the hidden lining of my jacket. My fingers closed around something cold and metallic. It wasn't a drive, it was a key. A key with a small brass tag that had an address I recognized, the old boarded-up library where my father used to spend his weekends. As the world turned to gray and my heart slowed to a crawl, the boardroom doors didn't open for the police or for Vane's men. They opened for a woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back in a ruthless bun. My mother stepped over Marcus Vane's twitching body and knelt beside me. She didn't look sad. She looked like a scientist checking a sample. She reached down and took the key from my fading grip. "Wake up, Elias," she whispered, her voice the last thing I heard. "The real game is finally beginning." I woke to the smell of old paper and ozone. My lungs felt like they had been scrubbed with wire brushes. Each breath, a rattling reminder of the mist that had filled the boardroom. I wasn't in a hospital, and I certainly wasn't in a jail cell. I was lying on a cold leather sofa in the center of my father's old library. The building had been boarded up for years, a relic of a middle-class life that felt like a fever dream now. But as my vision cleared, I realized the dust wasn't quite right. The stacks of books were still there, but between the mahogany shelves, sleek black server towers hummed with a low, predatory vibration. Blue fiber optic cables snaked across the floor like veins. The sedative has a lingering effect. Don't try to stand too quickly, a voice said. My mother was sitting at my father's old desk, illuminated by the glow of 3 high-resolution monitors. She wasn't wearing her kind widow sweater anymore. She was in a sharp slate-gray suit that screamed of quiet, terrifying authority. "Where is Vane?" I rasped, my voice sounding like it belonged to a ghost. "Marcus was a blunt instrument, Elias," she said, not looking up from her screen. "He served his purpose. He tested your greed, your vanity, and your survival instinct. But he became redundant. He started believing he was the one in charge. The Foundation doesn't tolerate delusions of grandeur." "And Arthur Vance? The SEC?" "Arthur was a necessary variable," she replied, finally turning her chair to face me. Her eyes were devoid of the maternal warmth I had relied on for 30 years. "He represented your father's path, the right way. By smashing that drive, you didn't just stop Vane, you destroyed Arthur's only hope of winning. You chose the middle ground, Elias. You chose to be a wild card, and that is exactly what I was hoping for." I managed to sit up, my head spinning. "You killed my father. You watched me struggle for years. You orchestrated every failure, every promotion. Why?" "To see if the alloy was pure," she said, standing up and walking toward me. "Most people are born into their roles. The Foundation's elite are tempered. We needed to see if you could carry the weight of the world without snapping under the pressure of a conscience you didn't actually earn. Your father's integrity was a cage, Elias. I opened the door. You walked out. Now you're ready to see the blueprint." She reached out and took the key from the table beside me, the key she had left in my blazer. She walked to a section of the library that had always been off limits when I was a child, the Special Collections Vault. It was a heavy, iron-reinforced door hidden behind a fake shelf of encyclopedias. She inserted the key, but she didn't turn it. She looked at me, a flicker of something resembling pride, or perhaps just professional satisfaction, in her gaze. "Inside this room is the archive. It's not just data, Elias. It's the leverage that keeps the global economy from collapsing into chaos. Every secret, every suppressed technology, every political accident for the last century is documented here. We don't just run companies. We curate history." "I don't want it," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I wanted a life, not a conspiracy." "You already lost your life the moment you signed that first audit for Vane," she countered. "There's no going back to the analyst in the cubicle. You either become the hand that moves the pieces, or you remain a piece to be moved, and pieces that have outlived their utility. Well, look at what happened to Marcus." She turned the key. The heavy door groaned open, revealing a room bathed in a soft amber light. It wasn't full of servers. It was full of filing cabinets, thousands of them, meticulously labeled. I followed her inside, drawn by a morbid curiosity I couldn't suppress. My eyes scanned the labels, names of nations, names of religions, names of families. And then, at the very back, a single drawer labeled the Miller lineage. My mother gestured to it. "Go on, see what your father was really protecting." I pulled the drawer open. Inside were dossiers, but they weren't about my father or me. They were about her. I saw photographs of my mother in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. In every photo, she looked exactly the same. Same age, same cold, calculating expression. 1974 Zurich, 1988 Tokyo, 2005 New York. She hadn't aged a day in 50 years. I backed away, the air in the vault suddenly feeling thin. What What are you? I am an architect, Elias, one of many. We are the stewards of the species, she said, her voice echoing in the small room. Your father wasn't your father. He was a guardian assigned to ensure your development stayed on track. He grew fond of the subject. He tried to steal you away from the program. That is why he had to be corrected. He thought he was saving a son. I was just protecting an investment. The horror of it was a physical weight. My entire existence, every hug, every good night, every lesson in morality was a manufactured simulation. I wasn't just a product of the foundation, I was a biological asset. And now, she said, stepping closer, the investment is matured. We are facing a crisis of leadership in the Western sector. The old guard is failing. We need a new face, someone with a story, a man who rose from nothing, faced corruption, and saved the SEC from a rogue CEO. You are going to be the next CEO of Sterling & Cross, Elias, but you will be reporting to me. And if I refuse? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then the simulation ends, she said simply, and I start over with subject 743. I looked around the vault, my mind racing. I had abandoned my principles for power, and in doing so, I had walked directly into the trap my mother had been building for 3 decades. I had no leverage, no allies. Arthur Vance was likely dead or compromised. Vane was gone. I was alone in a room full of the world's darkest secrets, facing a monster who wore the face of the woman who had tucked me into bed. But then, my hand brushed against a small leather-bound journal at the bottom of the Miller drawer. It was my father's handwriting. Not the handwriting of the teacher I knew, but a frantic, hurried scrawl. I palmed it, hiding it against my leg as my mother turned back to the monitors outside the vault. The board meeting is in 4 hours, she said. The narrative is already in place. You will be hailed as a hero. You will accept the position. You will do exactly as you are told. She walked out of the vault, leaving me alone for a moment. I opened the journal to the last page. There was no long explanation, no sentimental goodbye, just a single string of numbers, a coordinate, and a sentence that made my blood run cold. Elias, if you are reading this, the archive is a lie. Look at the shadows. I looked up. The amber lights in the vault were casting long, distorted shadows against the back wall. I moved toward them, my heart hammering. I realized the back wall wasn't solid. It was a projection. I reached through the light, my hand passing through what looked like heavy steel. Behind the holographic wall was a second, smaller room. There were no filing cabinets here, only a single chair facing a wall of monitors that were showing live feeds from across the globe. But these weren't feeds of banks or government buildings. They were feeds of people, thousands of them, all in their homes, all going about their lives, unaware of the cameras. And in the center monitor, there was a live shot of a high-security medical facility. In the bed, surrounded by machines, was a man. He was old, frail, and his head was shaved, covered in sensors. It was my father. He wasn't dead. But as I stared at the screen, he opened his eyes. He looked directly into the camera as if he knew I was there. He moved his hand, weakly, and pointed to something just off camera. I zoomed the feed in. Next to his bed was a heart rate monitor, but the rhythm wasn't a heartbeat. It was a code, a blinking sequence of lights. ISCO OS. And then a second message began to scroll across the bottom of the screen, one that hadn't been there a second ago. Subject 742, detected in restricted archive, initiating neural recalibration. The door to the vault slammed shut. The amber lights turned a violent, pulsing red. Elias, my mother's voice came over the intercom, and for the first time, there was a hint of genuine emotion in it. Not love, not pride, hunger. You really shouldn't have looked behind the curtain. Now we have to do this the hard way. Suddenly, the floor beneath the chair dropped away, and I was sliding into a dark, pressurized chute, the sound of my father's frantic, rhythmic heartbeat echoing in my ears as I plummeted toward the true heart of the foundation. The slide ended not with a crash, but with a sickeningly smooth deceleration into a pool of viscous, oxygenated gel. I scrambled out, coughing the blue fluid from my lungs, and looked around. I was no longer in the dusty library of my childhood or the gleaming glass towers of Stirling and Cross. I was in a cathedral of cold white light, a subterranean biomausoleum. Rows upon rows of glass cylinders lined the walls, stretching into a geometric infinity. Inside each one was a person, suspended in the same blue gel, their heads crowned with silver filaments that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light. These weren't just subjects, they were the processing power. The Foundation didn't just predict the world, they simulated it using the collective subconscious of thousands of broken, principled men and women. It's a beautiful architecture, isn't it? My mother stood at the far end of the hall near the central terminal where my father's frail body lay in his specialized unit. She was holding a surgical headset, its needles glistening like diamonds. "We don't just want you to lead, Elias," she said, her voice echoing with a terrifying clarity. "We want you to be the nexus, your struggle, your betrayal of your own ethics, your descent into greed. It provided the most volatile, high-energy data we've seen in a generation. You are the perfect catalyst to bridge the gap between human ambition and algorithmic certainty." I looked at my father. His eyes were open now, tracking me. The SOS code was still blinking on his monitor, but faster now, more frantic. "He's been the Nexus for 30 years, I whispered, the horror finally crystallizing. "That's why he died. You didn't kill him to hide the truth. You killed him to harvest it, and you used me to keep him tethered. He stayed alive for me." "He stayed alive because he was obsessed with your integrity," she sneered. "He thought if he could just endure the simulations long enough, he could find a way to warn you, to keep you pure. But in the end, you walked right into our arms for a 7-figure salary and a corner office. His sacrifice was for nothing." 2 men in sterile white suits stepped from the shadows and grabbed my arms. I didn't fight. I couldn't. I was staring at my father. He wasn't just pointing at a monitor anymore. He was staring at the key still clutched in my hand, the brass-tagged key from the library. The archive is a lie. Look at the shadows. I realized then that the key wasn't for a door. It was a physical override. The Foundation was a digital empire built on biological hardware, but it still required a physical ground. As they forced me into the chair next to my father, I didn't look at the needles. I looked at the base of his life support unit. There was a small, recessed slot, hidden behind a panel marked with the same geometric symbol that had been on my father's old books. "Neural integration in 3, 2, my mother began. With a roar of desperate primal strength, I kicked the technician to my left and lunged toward the base of my father's unit. I didn't try to save him. I didn't try to run. I jammed the brass key into the slot and twisted it with everything I had. "Elias, no!" my mother screamed, her composure finally shattering into a mask of pure rage. The world didn't explode. It didn't even flicker. Instead, a deep, resonant hum began to vibrate through the floor, a frequency so low I felt it in my teeth. The silver filaments on the thousands of cylinders turned from blue to a violent, searing red. The principles my father had instilled in me weren't just moral lessons. They were a cognitive firewall. By living a life of simulated integrity, followed by a catastrophic moral failure, I had created a system error within the Nexus. The key wasn't a bypass, it was a short circuit. The screens in the room began to scroll with white text at a blinding speed. "Critical ethical paradox detected. Input subject. 742 redeemed. Output null." The machine began to feed back into itself. The screams didn't come from the people in the tanks. They came from the servers. The foundation was a logic engine, and I had just introduced a variable it couldn't compute. A man who had truly seen the abyss of his own greed and decided to burn the ladder he used to get there. "You're destroying it all!" my mother shrieked, lunging for the console. 30 years of work! You'll die here. He'll die here. I looked at my father. For the first time in my life, I saw him smile. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of profound relief. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched my arm. "Let it burn," his eyes said. The blue gel in the tanks began to boil. The white light of the room turned into a blinding, featureless void as the neural network collapsed. I felt the silver needles graze my skin, but they couldn't find a purchase. My mind was no longer a predictable map of ambition and fear. It was a chaotic storm of regret and newfound clarity. "I abandoned my principles for power," I shouted over the roar of the collapsing system, looking directly at the woman who had birthed me but never loved me. But destiny had other plans. Destiny isn't a script, Mother. It's the choice we make when the script ends. The central core erupted in a silent flash of pure information. I woke up on the sidewalk of a rainy street in downtown Manhattan. The sun was just beginning to rise over the skyline. I was wearing my expensive suit, but it was tattered and stained with blue gel. Passers-by ignored me. Just another broken man in a city of millions. I checked my pocket. No phone, no wallet, no key. I stood up, my legs shaking, and looked toward the Sterling and Cross building. It was still there, but as I watched, the digital ticker tape that ran around its facade began to glitch. The stock prices plummeted to zero. The names of the board members were replaced with a single, repeating sentence: "The debt is paid." I walked to a public park and sat on a bench, watching the world wake up. I had nothing. No career, no penthouse, no family. The man I had been for the last 6 months was dead. The man I had been for the 30 years before that was a lie. But then, a man sat down on the bench next to me. He was old, wearing a simple high school teacher's jacket. He looked tired, his skin pale and his hair white, but his eyes were clear. He didn't say anything. He just handed me a small, weathered book from his pocket. I opened the cover. Inside, in his familiar, steady hand, was a note. "Integrity isn't a currency, Elias. It's the only thing you own that the world can't take back. Now, let's go home." I looked at my father, the real man, freed from the machine. We weren't powerful. We weren't rich. We were just two men sitting on a bench in the rain. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, terrifyingly free. The new Elias was gone, and the old Elias was a memory. I didn't know what came next, and for a man who had tried to buy the future, that was the greatest joy of all. I stood up, left the expensive blazer on the bench, and walked into the morning fog with the only man who had ever taught me how to be human. The world was still full of thieves and architects, but they no longer